Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Den of the Drake. Other dragons hoard gold, while I hoard internet cringe. If you've watched my channel for long enough, you probably have guessed that of the three pillars of D&D, those being roleplay, combat, and exploration, the roleplay pillar is by far my favorite. IRL, I get enough of combat while attending the homeless fight club outside Denny's every Thursday night. And as for IRL exploration, well, we don't like to talk about that in polite company. But what about IRL roleplay? Well, of course there's no practical outlet for anything like that now, is there? Is there? Well, it just so happens that there is! Welcome to the world of live-action role-playing, or LARP for short. Yes, for the low price of your dignity, you too can dress as a wizard and throw beanbags at people in the woods pretending that they're lightning bolts, while also beating people over the head with a pool noodle that's supposed to be a sword. Ah, memories. I tried to join a LARP group, but they told me to go home because I brought my warhammer made from a rusty pipe and shreds of an old t-shirt. Like my dad used to say, roleplay ain't worth it if you don't break a few fingers. The saga I have for you today stars a live-action role-player who gets caught in the tidal wave of unwashed, nerdy hilarity as a mix of god-awful planning and problem player tomfoolery causes the LARP to collapse into a nerdy version of what happened at the last Fire Festival. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right into the horrifying world of r/RPG-Horror-Stories. Enjoy. This week's story comes from Reddit user Bob Quasit and is titled LARP from Hell. It was long ago. Worldcon, a hotel room, 6 gamers, and an agenda. Stuart had invited us. He was a relative newcomer to the group and a bit domineering. He wanted to start a LARP group in the area, and he wanted us to help. This was back in the earlier days of LARPing. Vampire the Masquerade was still a few years in the future. There were some LARP organizations around. The largest in our region was an aggressive group that I'll call Caligula. More about them later. What Stuart wanted to do was start a new branch of an organization based on the popular novel Dream Park, which, in many ways, inspired the creation of modern LARPing. In the room were myself, my roommate Fred, and a few other friends. Stuart laid out the proposition. He'd start a new branch, and we could all join by buying a membership. Only 2 of us agreed. A year later, no games had been run. Stuart called another meeting and announced that he'd come up with an idea to get the organization really moving. We would raise funding for the new group by running a game and dinner event and charging for it. The 6 of us would play the NPCs and serve the dinner. Stuart had already written the adventure and booked a church basement in a surprisingly upscale area, the most prestigious street in the city. For whatever reason, we all agreed to take part. The game was called The Revel. To promote it, we made up flyers and posted them everywhere. To my amazement, about 40 people sent in checks. That would make more than enough money if we could pull off the event. It was a relatively simple story. It began with a feast at court, which would, of course, be the dinner part of the event. As the meal finished, a renegade knight would burst in with his men. Seizing the princess, the knight announces that there will be a contest of wits for possession of the maiden. A riddling competition. 10 riddles would be asked, 5 for the king and the audience, 5 for the villain and his henchmen. The good guys, of course, would win, but the villain steals the princess anyway and flees. The king announces a quest to rescue the princess, which is the promotion for the next adventure. The end. If things went right. I should note a few points. This plot was, in fact, stolen almost completely from the movie The Green Knight. So was almost all of the dialogue. Stuart was an out-and-out plagiarist. Among the riddles was a classic from The Hobbit. Most of the rest of the riddles were really bad, though. In many cases, there was more than one obviously valid answer. A single correct answer was written down, but it was obvious that there were other answers which made as much or more sense than the official ones. Right away, I sensed potential problems. I'm really good at that. The riddle contest worried me. The only outcome allowed was for the good guys to win. What if there was a tie? What if the bad guys won? Stuart laughed at me. That couldn't happen, he said. He'd be playing one of the henchmen, and he'd make sure that the bad guys missed enough riddles to lose. The guy playing the Riddle Master NPC was nervous too. He had told us all very clearly that he could not make up any riddles on the fly. I urged Stuart again to write a few extra riddles just in case. Again, he laughed at me and refused. He and I never really got along very well. I was nervous. I'd been assigned to play the king. Maybe it was because of the red beard. And my roommate Fred was playing the villain. Although Stuart had written a detailed word-for-word script, he didn't give us copies until the night before the game. We stayed up late, desperately trying to memorize our lines. The next day, we arrived early at the church and set up the dinner. Guests started arriving a little early, but that was okay. The hall was fairly crowded, and the dinner went well. The time for the main event drew near. A pounding at the door, the villain entered, magnificent in black armor. He seized the princess, and the contest was on. The court herald was the riddle master, asking each side in turn a riddle from his book. Both sides got their first riddles right, 1-1. The second riddle was for the king's faction, and was answered correctly by a guest. Fred, the villain, had planned to get that one wrong, but Stuart was playing one of his henchmen at his side, and quietly insisted that they answer the riddle correctly. 2-2. The good guys missed the third riddle. I couldn't blame them, it was obscure and ridiculous. Fred was about to miss the third one too when a PC shouted out the correct answer. He had no choice but to smile mockingly and thank her for her help. So the score was now good guys 2, bad guys 3. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. The fourth riddle for the good guys was the absolute worst of the lot. The PCs all murmured, trying to figure it out. Finally, I, the king, stood up and gave the correct answer myself. When the PCs nearby congratulated me, I smiled regally and said, "Oh, you must know these things when you're king, you know." Fred tried to miss the answer to the fourth question for the bad guys. But once again, Stuart whispered in his ear and insisted that the correct answer be given. Stuart was a pretty big and intense guy, and Fred gave in, which left the score at good guys 3, bad guys 4. With one riddle left for each side, you can probably see the problem here. If both sides answered correctly, the bad guys would win 5-4. If both sides failed to answer, the bad guys won again 4-3. And if the good guys answered and the bad guys failed, we'd have a tie. The one outcome that I had warned of and which Stuart dismissed as impossible. Fred and I stared at each other across the room in a panic. The riddle master turned away. It was clear that he'd be of no help. There was no way to complete the scenario as written. That goddamned Stuart. I was about to suggest a tiebreaker in which I'd ask a riddle of my own. I had a few in my head for the villain to answer. But Fred acted before I could. He announced that he had become bored with the contest, and that he was going to take the princess anyway. Making off with the princess and his henchmen, they barred the door behind them. At which point I announced the quest in the next game and sat down in my throne shaking. The crowd seemed okay with it, mostly, although some seemed a little puzzled. Still, no one asked for their money back. After a bit more talking, the event ended and the audience left. Stuart took off. The rest of us cleaned up and then we headed for the subway to go home. It was late and we were all tired. Little did we know that the real horror for the evening was yet to come. Oh boy, as seemingly mortifying as this part was, one thing really stuck out to me. What the fuck does an aggressive LARP group look like? I'm imagining an organized gang of neckbeards pulling razor blades on anyone who even looks at a pair of latex elf ears. But before we explore that concept in part 2, let's reflect. Now, I don't have a lot of experience with RPG stuff, and I have zero experience with LARP. The only real surface-level exposure I have to LARP was when I was a young buck way back when. Back in high school, I played on my school's football team as the right tackle. And one day, me and my football buddies were f***ing around in the computer lab looking for any local activities that gave us the opportunity to participate in violence, as young gents like us were wont to do. We came across this cool, full-contact sport, where dudes dressed like fantasy characters in full battle armor just beat the crap out each other with blunted swords. One more Google search later, and the truth about LARP was revealed to us, and was immediately dropped as an option for us to partake in. Yeah, I mean, it looked fun, but I didn't think that Stacy from 5th period would be into me if she knew that I was a wizard on the weekends. And now, here I am as a grown-ass man being a dragon on the weekends, so la-di f***ing da, I guess. Now that I'm older and I don't really care what people think, I might be open to giving it a try, but I'm still unsure whether it would really be for me or not. I can imagine that the planning that goes into a regular RPG session is like tenfold when it comes to LARP, considering how big of an operation it often becomes. Plus, the threat of problem players becomes an even bigger deal because I imagine when you got that many moving pieces that the squeakiest gears can really ruin the whole machine for everyone involved. So many ways that it can go wrong makes the whole idea of LARP a pretty daunting thing to undertake. I imagine the best LARPs are the ones that don't really take themselves too seriously. Kinda like this Wasteland Weekend thing that I found that takes place every year in the Mojave, where people just show up dressed like Mad Max characters, get drunk, and party in the Thunderdome, without any huge overarching plot for the organizers to worry about. But even then on the website, it explicitly says that it's not a LARP. But that is an event I definitely want to go to, so I don't know. Maybe one day I'll give LARP a chance. But until that day, let's go ahead and investigate what an aggressive LARP group looks like. A quick explanation. This continuation is not strictly RPG horror. It's real horror in the aftermath of our first LARP event, which was described in part 1. I hope it will be interesting at least. The second half sets up additional LARP horror to come. We headed to the subway. The event had totally stressed us all out. Stewart hadn't said a damned thing about the crap he pulled, and he never did explain or discuss it, he just glowered. Under the circumstances, the rest of us were glad that he had driven home on his own. 3 of us took the same train. Me, my roommate Fred, and Bill, who had played the Court Herald and Riddle Master. We got 3 seats together. It was late, so the train was moving fairly slowly. At the first stop after we got on, there was quite a commotion. About 20 teens came screaming, literally, out of the coach next to ours and burst into our coach. They seemed pretty wild, and they stayed that way, running up and down the aisle and yelling at each other. A conductor came out and started trying to quiet them down. As they ignored him, he started yelling. He was a big guy, and some of them started paying attention. One very skinny guy was coiled up on a seat near the conductor. Without any warning, he lashed out and slashed the conductor's face open. I think he had some sort of razor ring on, but it happened too quickly for me to be sure. Blood pouring out of his face, the conductor grabbed the guy's head in one massive hand and smashed his skull repeatedly against a nearby pole. Blood splattered again. Somewhere in there, Bill tried to get up, presumably to do something. But Fred and I were on each side of him, more experienced with the city than he was. We grabbed him and kept him in his seat. All the teens were screaming like banshees. Dropping the guy, the conductor went out the door onto the platform, leaving a trail of blood behind him. All the doors slid shut, and there was a moment of silence. Then the pandemonium began. The girls in the gang, I presume it was a gang, were shrieking like harpies from hell. It was bedlam. The boys were raging and taking out weapons, mostly knives. The rest of us just sat there, eyeing each other in silent panic. I can still remember the looks on the faces of the elderly couple opposite of us. The train didn't move. I couldn't help wondering why the gang didn't just force the doors open and leave. The guy who'd cut the conductor had been on the ground for a while, but now he picked himself up and joined the others who were stalking up and down the aisle and bellowing. He roared that he wouldn't go back to jail. I heard the girls screeching, sounding oddly gleeful, that he had a gun, and the train still didn't move. It felt as if time had stopped. Then finally the train started to roll. It rumbled to the next station and stopped for a while with the doors closed. I wondered what would happen. Surely the police would come. Would there be a shootout? A hostage situation? Anything seemed possible. A long pause and the doors slid open. There was nobody visible on the platform outside. No police, nobody at all. The gang got off the train and left. I have to admit that I was a little surprised that nothing was done. The train continued on, and that was the end of the excitement for that night. We picked up quite a few members from that first event, and new ones kept trickling in. games began to be run mostly one-day single-track outdoor adventures set in the woods. But we also had some non-combat games and events set indoors. Things were moving along. We decided to set up a recruitment table at a large regional science fiction and fantasy convention. One of our new members had worked up a clever device, a demonstration lockpick. It consisted of a nicely finished box with a battery inside, a projecting spiral of thick copper wire, and a wire loop with a handle that was wired to the box. In order to pick the lock, the loop had to be moved down the length of the spiral, which was irregular, and touch the box without touching the spiral wire. If the wire loop touched the spiral wire, a light would flash and a buzzer would buzz, meaning failure. It was basically kind of like Operation. Our table was a big success. People swarmed the lockpick test, particularly kids. At my suggestion, we offered a prize for successful lockpicking: golden chocolate coins. We also had some weapons on display, regulation padded ones. But perhaps the biggest draw was one of our newer members who was staffing the table. She was vivacious, enthusiastic, very pretty, and wearing an extremely low-cut dress. I imagine it didn't hurt that she bent forward a lot. All of that was her own idea, by the way. Let's call her Celeste. She and Fred had become a couple soon after she had joined the organization. After a while, I noticed that a different-looking crowd was at the table. They wore some pretty impressive garb, and they all seemed to match somehow. They seemed a bit patronizing about the lockpick test and weapons, but they were all over Celeste. Apparently, they were from an already established LARP organization, which I will refer to as Caligula. They had lots to tell us about how wonderful Caligula was. A bit later, I was taking a break from the table when somebody hailed me. He took me aside and told me to watch out. He had been a part of another LARP organization, and Caligula had taken an interest in them too. He said they had cherry-picked key members, given them major roles in Caligula, and then with the help of those key members had destroyed their organization. Not only that, but they had done that to several other LARP groups in the area over the past few years. This troubled me a bit. Later on during the day, a couple of other people warned me of the same thing. Caligula was predatory and treated all other LARP organizations as enemies, targets for takeover and destruction. They seemed sincere. That evening, I wandered to the table to see if the flyers I had put out advertising our group were being taken. The table wasn't manned at the time. Just as I walked towards the stack and reached out to see how many were left, someone ran up to me saying, No, don't take those!" He thrust a flyer into my hand and dropped a big stack of the same flyers on our table. They were, of course, Caligula flyers. We didn't see Celeste that evening. When we ran into her the next morning, she was bubbly and exhilarated. She told us that she'd spent the last night with her new Caligula friends. They'd invited her to join them at their next event. She couldn't wait to go with us. Later, she introduced us to her new buddies. She seemed under the impression that Fred and I were invited to the event too, but the Caligula leader apparently hadn't expected that. After some hemming and hawing, he agreed that Fred and I could come, but we'd have to pay the usual fee of $45 each. Celeste was over the moon the whole way home after the con. Fred and I were a little more quiet. I told him what I'd heard from others about Caligula, and about what had happened at our table with the flyers. I think we were both feeling a little bit apprehensive, but not, it turned out, apprehensive enough. When I made that joke about neckbeards pulling out switchblades, I didn't think it was prophecy. Well, half prophecy. Instead of a bunch of neckbeards, it was a bunch of loser tough guys trying to intimidate Johnny Q Public. Let's talk about the first half of this part first. This kind of crap is why the idea that anyone would want to live in a big city like this is astounding to me. Forget that the degradation of Western civilization spreads from these urban populations like some kind of cancer. Claustrophobic, stinking of piss, and a potential mugging around every corner? No, thank you. Call me hick trash, but nothing that big cities offers sounds even remotely appetizing to me anymore. I mean, if you want to pay $2,000 a month to live in a 300-square-foot roach-infested apartment so you can watch the moral decay of man firsthand, more power to you. It's just not for me. Now, a while back in this video right here, I went on a bit of an out-of-place tangent about how important it is to develop situational awareness so that you can react to scenarios like this one. The world we live in, especially if you live in a big city like I used to, is not always the safest. And it's also important that you recognize a potential threat before it can even become one. I am 100% for people arming themselves because sometimes danger has a funny habit of making sure that you can't react to it. But there's a reason that when you take a CCW class, half of the time the instructor is pointing at your gun and yelling, "Never use this." Recognition leads to avoidance, and avoidance leads to everyone going home. And the goal of anyone who gets caught up in a dangerous situation is to be able to go home afterwards. Anyway, onto the less heavy but still cringeworthy section of part 2. Now, I know it's not the real name, but tell me why Caligula is exactly the kind of name that a group of weaponized neckbeards would name themselves. If there's anyone who's familiar with how LARP politics work, can you comment down below if it's common for predatory tactics like this to be used? You'd think with all the stigma around LARP that they'd be happy that there's more interest in the hobby, but nah. Leave it to the people who play adult dress-up to gatekeep a hobby that already gatekeeps itself. I might be reading too much into it by expecting rational thinking from people who like to be wizards on the weekend, but I can always hold out hope because damn it, I just want it to be cool one day. 3 of us had been invited to spend a weekend with rival LARP organization Caligula. I had been warned that they had viewed all other LARP groups as target for hostile takeover and destruction, but I still never quite dreamed how bad things would be. Quick recap. I was a member of a relatively new LARP organization, which I will call LAM. This was back around 1992, as I recall. We promoted our group at a local convention, and Celeste was approached by members of a much larger and more established group that all call Caligula. They invited her to join them on a game weekend in a couple of months. She asked them to invite her boyfriend, Fred, who was also my roommate at the time, and me as well. They reluctantly agreed. The weekend was to take place in mid-March. Preparations were made. Fred made an impressive suit of armor for himself with surprising ease, sewing a piece of leather-like black vinyl into a long tabard and inserting small metal studs. On his arms went vambraces of the same material, held in place with lacing. All in all, it was a very impressive costume. With black cloak and black beret, the effect was pretty cool. For my part, I wore black boots, plain gray pants, and an undertunic of white with brown lace fastenings at wrist and throat, a gray cap sleeve tunic trimmed with a bright ribbon and belted with dragon-impressed belt of brown leather. Overall, I wore a heavy cloak of black wool fastened with a small clasp. I carried no weapons as A, I had none, and B, I didn't really want to fight. I'm not very good at it. My strategy was to bluff or run. Did I mention that I once won a medal for the 50-yard dash? Okay, it was a bronze medal in the 2nd grade, but I digress. The adventure was to take place over the entire weekend at a scout camp south of the city. We would be sleeping in unheated log cabins. At the council of my friends, I brought a sleeping bag and a pad on Friday along with a woolen hat. As soon as we came home from work on Friday, we prepared to drive to the camp. Me, my roommate Fred, not his real name, and Fred's girlfriend, a LAM official named Celeste, not her real name, set out on the trip. I should remark here that Fred and I were invited by afterthought. The person who was really invited to the game was Celeste, who had been assiduously courted by Caligula. She kindly brought us along, having made arrangements with the head of Caligula far in advance. When we arrived, we were struck by the deepest cold of the year. It was bone-chilling, and the wind blew icily across a large frozen pond. Even in my cloak, I was freezing. Finding a large central wooden building, we got into a line of costume participants to register. It took a very long time to get to the head of the line, and it seemed longer, as the vast majority of the line was outside in the cold. Standing in line, we heard distressing news. The weekend had been overbooked, and there were no more cabins available. We would have to find sleeping space where we could. The central tavern/registration building was open for use, but it was a log building heated by a single fireplace. And with the wind chill, the temperature was getting below 0. I think the temperature that day actually set a record. When we got to the head of the line, a problem developed. Celeste's papers were all in order, but there were no records of Fred's or my existence. Nonetheless, we were kindly helped by some check-in people. Celeste was soon rushed off to join her retinue. The Caligula people had arranged for her to be one of the nobility, complete with bodyguards, companions, many role-playing opportunities, and, most importantly, a warm place to sleep. The private heated building for nobility, in fact. Fred and I were left to our own devices. For the next several hours, Fred and I walked around the campsite. It was, as I've said, bitterly cold, but many people were walking about in the dark, and it was a very atmospheric situation. After a while, we went to the opening ceremonies. A dramatic local politics scene played out. One of them included Celeste in a place of honor with their noble faction. Fred and I stood at the back like the nobodies we were. When that was over, we got back in the car and drove back home to sleep. It was just too damn cold to sleep outside. We would come back in the morning. It was about a 45-minute drive, by the way. When we arrived at camp the next morning, the first thing we did was go to the smithy to have Fred's longsword approved. A Caligula friend of Celeste's had kindly made a pair of Caligula swords for Fred. After a long day, the smiths looked at Fred's weapon. They proclaimed it unacceptable due to the insufficient foam padding at the tip, although other identical weapons had been passed without question. We were told that we could purchase a more open-celled foam to pad the tip with game money. There was just one problem. We didn't have any game money. Turns out we were supposed to be issued some when we registered, but there had been an error. We headed to the registration to see what could be done. Should I mention that up to this point, we had been pretty much ignored? The Smiths had been quite brusque with us, offering no help or advice until asked repeatedly. In subtle ways, we were being made to feel like unpersons. That morning, no one talked to us. We had 0 role-playing opportunities at all. Ever been to a party where you didn't know anybody and nobody wanted to know you? Yeah. When we got to registration, we found it virtually deserted. There was only one person there and only one person for him to talk to. After quite a long wait, he acknowledged our presence. Very politely, we explained our situation. By some error, we hadn't received any starting money. What should we do? Was this the right place to ask about this? The registration guy sneered masterfully and assured us that, yes, this was the right place, and that he wasn't going to do anything about it. All the money was gone. I'm closed. Go away. Let me interject here that this guy was one of those people who radiated contempt. The kind of guy who makes it instantly clear that he despises the hell out of you. One of those guys who really needs to have his face smashed in. We didn't want to bother him, but we really needed the money, we told him. Was there anyone else we could talk to about this?
No, I'm the one you need to talk to, and I'm not going to do anything. All the money has been given out, and that is that. Tough.
We worked it out to get lost as quickly as possible. Wasn't there anyone we could talk to about this? Anyone who could help us?
What are you, morons? There is no more money. I'm in charge and I am closed. How dare you take up my valuable time?
We left, though I don't know how we did it without losing it completely. What a jerk. Even if he had said, sorry, it would have made a difference. But, of course, he didn't. It was still freezing. Fred and I got in the car and got the hell out of there. Celeste decided to stay for the rest of the weekend. Looking back, though, Fred and I made the right choice. The cold that weekend was really deadly. Several people got hypothermia, and there were many cases of frostbite that weekend. A Caligula guy gave Celeste a ride home at the end of the weekend. When we next saw her, she was on cloud 9. She'd had the time of her life! Apart from sleeping warm and being constantly praised and admired by everyone, she had also met her soulmate. He was a wonderful boy, who was like the other half she had never known existed. It's possible that Fred's face gave something away, since Celeste was his girlfriend. She quickly added that,
of course, my new soulmate was like a brother to me.
Cynics won't be surprised to hear that within a month, Celeste was f***ing her brother. And of course, she dropped Fred and Lamb at the same time. I heard a rumor a year or two later that she had moved into a house full of Caligula members, including her soulmate. I have no idea what happened to her after that. Lamb survived, but it never really flourished. Caligula still exists to this day. I don't know if they still attack other groups, but I suppose that it wouldn't be surprising if they did. End of story. She belongs to the streets! Honestly, it may seem like Caligula got away with their shenanigans, but in my eyes, they now got a ticking time bomb named Celeste putting her feet up on their dime. And everyone knows that she's only waiting until she meets her next soulmate before she moves on. As for the Caligula people themselves, God, what a bunch of assholes. I don't even know where to start. I mean, this story takes place before I was even born. So I don't know if this is just nerd culture from the time or what. But you'd think with the amount of planning that goes into a LARP event, they'd take the time to at least let everyone know that, hey, you're about to be given the old hypothermia special, bitch! Yeah, I get the fact that they got a reputation for not being the warmest, pun intended, towards rival LARP groups. But the fact that the concept of a rival LARP group even exists is just beyond stupid to me. Not even haha funny stupid, but paying $8 for Twitter verification stupid. Leave it to Reddit to make me think that people who drive out into the middle of the forest to discuss magical politics might not be the most socially adjusted people. And on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at this week's Gallery of the Drake. This week's fan art comes from viewer When the Sun Corrupts and depicts the aftermath of what happens in the face of long-term edgelord exposure. Yes, it would appear that even I am not immune. Oh no! It's the evil Drake! Quick, Larry, shoot him! I always pay my taxes on time and volunteer at the local soup kitchen to help the homeless. Oh, bullshit! Any real Drake would be spending his afternoons blowing up geese with M80s and lighting fire to the dumpsters behind Wendy's. I would much rather call my mother and ask her how her day went.
Are we sure that that's the evil one?
We're not here to discuss the gray area of morality, Larry. Thank you again, The Sun Corrupts, for submitting your art. If you'd like to see your artwork featured in Gallery of the Drake, go ahead and send it to the email in my About section. Fan art is my favorite part of doing YouTube, and it means the world to me that I can inspire artists like you to create artwork like this. With the story over and artwork displayed, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you feel like supporting the channel further, my Patreon and merchandise links are in the description. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time in the Den of the Drake.